Case 1. The officer who walked into the wrong apartment. Amber Geiger's case begins with a mistake she said she made after a long shift. But in court, the question became much deeper than a mistake. It became a question of responsibility, judgment, power, and the life of an innocent man inside his own home. Amber Geiger was a Dallas police officer. She had spent years in law enforcement, carried a badge, wore a uniform, and belonged to a profession built around observation. Police work depends on details. Doors, floors, numbers, threats, warnings. The difference between danger and confusion can be a matter of life and death. On September 6, 2018, Geiger returned to the apartment building where she lived in Dallas, Texas. Inside that same building lived Botham Jean. Botham was 26 years old. He was originally from St. Lucia and worked as an accountant. To the people who loved him, he was not a headline. He was a son, a brother, a friend, and a man building a life in a city that should have been full of opportunity. That night, Botham was inside his own apartment. He was not committing a crime. He was not threatening anyone. He was in the one place where a person should feel safest. His own home. Amber Geiger later said she believed she was entering her own apartment. According to her account, she went to the wrong floor, approached Botham's door, and thought she had found an intruder inside what she believed was her home. Then she fired her weapon. Botham Jean was killed. At first, the story carried the strange shape of confusion. A police officer saying she walked into the wrong apartment. A man dead in his own home. A building layout. A door. A moment of fear. But that image would not survive the courtroom without being challenged. The central question was not only whether Geiger was confused. The question was whether that confusion justified killing Botham Jean. Prosecutors argued that it did not. They pointed to the details she missed. The signs that should have told her she was not where she thought she was. The apartment number. The floor. The surroundings. The decisions she made after seeing someone inside. They argued that a trained officer should have recognized the danger of acting too quickly. They argued that Botham was the person with the right to be there, not Geiger. Her defense told the jury she made a tragic mistake and believed she was defending herself from an intruder. In that version, she was not entering as an aggressor, but as a frightened person who misunderstood her surroundings. But the jury had to weigh that explanation against the life that was taken. Botham Jean was not in her apartment. She was in his. That fact became the moral center of the case. The trial drew national attention because it touched on issues larger than one shooting. It raised questions about police accountability, racial justice, fear, training, and how the law treats officers who claim they made deadly mistakes. For many people, the case was terrifying because it reversed the idea of home safety. Botham did not encounter danger in the street. He was not stopped during a chase. He was not inside someone else's space. He was home. And the person who entered with a gun was a police officer. In 2019, Amber Geiger was convicted of murder. The jury sentenced her to 10 years in prison. That sentence created strong reactions. Some people believe the conviction itself was an important moment of accountability, because police officers are rarely convicted of murder for shootings. Others believed the sentence was too light for the death of an innocent man in his own apartment. The courtroom became even more emotional when Botham's brother, Brant Jean, addressed Geiger directly. His statement of forgiveness became one of the most widely discussed moments of the trial. But forgiveness from one grieving family member did not erase the crime, the conviction, or the public questions that remained. The legal process continued after sentencing. Geiger appealed her conviction, but the appellate court affirmed the trial court's judgment. Years later, a civil jury also found against her and awarded Botham Jean's family nearly $100 million in damages. By then, Amber Geiger's police career was long gone. Her badge had become part of a story about failure, not service. This case fits the title because one decision destroyed everything attached to her public image. Before that night, she was a police officer with authority and trust. After that night, she became the former officer convicted of murdering a man inside his own home. But the deepest loss was not her career. It was Botham Jean's life. A career can end. A sentence can be served. Appeals can be filed. Public debate can move on to the next case. But Botham's family cannot recover the future he lost. He should have been safe behind his own door. He should have had more birthdays, more calls with family, more workdays, more ordinary evenings, more life. Amber Geiger's case remains powerful because it shows how quickly authority can become danger when judgment fails. It shows how a badge does not remove responsibility. And it shows that even when an officer claims fear, the evidence still has to answer one question. Who had the right to be there? In this case, the answer was Botham Jean. and the officer who entered his world with a gun destroyed her career the moment she took his life. Case 2. The veteran officer who reached for the wrong weapon. Some careers end because of corruption. Others end because of cruelty. But Kim Potter's career ended in a moment she described as a mistake. A moment that killed a young man and left a community asking how a veteran officer could make an error so deadly. Kim Potter had spent decades in law enforcement. She was not a brand new officer still learning how to function under pressure. She was experienced. She had been trained. She had worked in a profession where seconds matter, where weapon awareness matters, and where the difference between one tool and another can be the difference between life and death. That is why the case became so difficult for the public to process. Because the central question was not whether police work can be stressful. Everyone understands that it can be. The question was whether stress could explain the death of Dante Wright. Dante was 20 years old. He was a son, a father, and a young man whose life was still unfolding. To his family he was not a symbol or a legal argument. He was someone they loved, someone they expected to see again, someone whose future should not have ended during a traffic stop. On April 11, 2021, police in Brooklyn Center, Minnesota, stopped Dante Wright's vehicle. What began as a traffic stop quickly became something more serious when officers learned there was a warrant connected to him. Officers attempted to arrest him. There was a struggle near the car. Dante moved back toward the driver's seat. In that chaotic moment, Kim Potter shouted that she would use her taser. But the weapon in her hand was not her taser. It was her firearm. She fired one shot. Dante Wright was fatally wounded. The body camera footage became central to the case because it showed the moment as it unfolded. It showed the traffic stop, the attempt to arrest Dante, the commands, the confusion, the weapon, and Potter's reaction after the shot. Her defense would later argue that she had made a tragic mistake, confusing her gun for her taser during a fast-moving arrest. But the first story, even if emotionally powerful, still had to face the evidence. Prosecutors argued that Potter's actions were reckless and negligent. They pointed to her years of training. They pointed to the differences between a handgun and a taser: weight, placement, feel, color, and training procedures. They argued that an experienced officer should have known what was in her hand before pulling the trigger. The case was not charged as murder. That matters. Prosecutors did not argue that Potter went into the stop planning to kill Dante Wright. They argued that her conduct met the legal standard for manslaughter. In other words, the case was about a death caused by a reckless or culpably negligent act, not a planned killing. That distinction became important in court, but it did not make the loss smaller for Dante's family. The trial took place in a state already carrying the weight of recent police violence. Dante Wright was killed only miles from Minneapolis while the trial of Derek Chauvin, the former officer convicted in George Floyd's murder, was still unfolding. The timing made the public reaction even stronger. Another black man was dead after contact with police. Another family was grieving. Another community was asking whether training, systems, and accountability were enough. Kim Potter took the stand during her trial. She cried as she described the moment. She said she did not want to hurt anyone. Her defense presented her as a good officer who made the worst mistake of her life. But the jury had to answer a legal question, not only an emotional one. Was the mistake criminal? After deliberation, the jury found Potter guilty of first-degree manslaughter and second-degree manslaughter. The conviction destroyed what remained of her law enforcement career. She had already resigned from the Brooklyn Center Police Department shortly after the shooting. Now she was not only a former officer. She was a convicted former officer. At sentencing, the courtroom became a place of grief and disagreement. Dante's family spoke about the depth of their loss. His mother, Katie Wright, described a life permanently changed. His father, Arbui Wright, expressed anger over what he believed was a sentence far too light. The family wanted accountability that reflected the life taken from them. Judge Regina Chu sentenced Kim Potter to 24 months, with 16 months to be served in prison and the remaining time on supervised release. The judge acknowledged that the sentence was a significant downward departure from the sentencing guidelines and described the case as deeply sad. That sentence became controversial almost immediately. Some people believed the court recognized that Potter had not intended to kill. Others believed the sentence failed to reflect the seriousness of taking a life, especially by someone trained and trusted to carry weapons responsibly. That tension is why the case remains so debated. Kim Potter's supporters saw her as a veteran officer devastated by a tragic error. Dante Wright's family saw something else, a trained officer whose recklessness took away their son. Both images were present in the courtroom, but only one person lost his life. Dante Wright did not get to explain his future. He did not get to watch his child grow older in the way his family hoped. He did not get to walk away from that traffic stop and become the man he might have become. That is the emotional center of the case. When a police officer makes a mistake, the consequences can fall on someone who never agreed to carry that risk. Kim Potter eventually served 16 months and was released from prison. But her career in policing was over. Her name became tied forever to one fatal moment, one wrong weapon, and one question that still follows the case. How could an experienced officer make a mistake that deadly? This case fits the title because it shows how 1 second can destroy a career built over decades. A badge does not erase responsibility. A long career does not undo the consequence of a fatal decision. And a mistake, when made by someone carrying state power and a loaded gun, can still become a crime. Kim Potter's public image was once that of a trained officer trusted to respond under pressure. After Dante Wright's death, that image collapsed. The courtroom did not treat her as a monster. But it did treat her as legally responsible. And for Dante Wright's family, no sentence could bring back the young man who should have survived a traffic stop. Case 3, the detective whose cold case came back. Some police careers collapse in public in the same moment the crime happens. Others collapse years later when the past finally catches up. The case of Stephanie Lazarus is one of those stories. For years she was not known to the public as a suspect. She was known as a Los Angeles police officer and later as a detective. She had a badge, a career, and the authority that comes with being inside the very system responsible for solving crimes. But hidden behind that career was a murder case from 1986. The victim was Sherry Rasmussen. Sherry was 29 years old. She was a nurse, newly married, and living in Los Angeles with her husband, John Rutan. She had a career, a marriage, and a future that should have continued far beyond the morning her life ended. Before the murder, Stephanie Lazarus had known John Rutan. They had been romantically involved before his marriage to Sherry. Prosecutors later argued that jealousy and obsession were part of the hidden emotional tension behind the crime. That is what made this case so disturbing. Because Stephanie Lazarus was not only a person with a personal connection to the victim's husband. She was also a police officer. Someone trained to understand evidence, investigations, crime scenes, and the way detectives build a case. On February 24, 1986, Sherry Rasmussen was found dead inside the condo she shared with her husband. At first, the case was treated as a possible burglary gone wrong. That early theory shaped the investigation for years. It pushed attention away from the personal history surrounding Sherry, John, and Stephanie. It also meant that a woman with a clear emotional connection to the marriage did not become the center of the case in the way Sherry's family believed she should have. Sherry's father suspected Stephanie Lazarus early. He believed the case was not simply about a random intruder. But those suspicions did not immediately lead to an arrest. And so the case went cold. Years passed. Stephanie Lazarus continued her career in law enforcement. She remained inside the world of policing while Sherry's family lived with unanswered questions. That is one of the most painful parts of this case. The person later convicted was not hiding in another country, living under a new name or running from police. She was part of the police world itself. But cold cases have a way of waiting. Evidence that once seemed silent can become powerful when technology changes. Old files can be reopened. Old assumptions can be tested. And the first story can collapse when new science gives investigators something they did not have before. In this case, the turning point was DNA. Investigators re-examined evidence from the crime scene, including DNA connected to a bite mark on Sherry. That DNA profile did not support the old burglary theory in the way investigators had once believed. Eventually, attention turned back toward Stephanie Lazarus. Detectives obtained a DNA sample from Lazarus without directly confronting her. The sample was compared to the evidence from the crime scene. It matched. That match changed everything. A case that had sat unresolved for more than 2 decades now had a direct link to a veteran LAPD detective. The public image of Stephanie Lazarus as an officer and investigator began to collapse under the weight of the evidence. In 2009 she was arrested. The arrest itself carried a strange and unsettling feeling. A detective was being taken into custody for a murder that had happened 23 years earlier. The person accused had spent much of that time working in a profession built around law, order, and justice. The investigation also raised painful questions about the original case. Why had the burglary theory held for so long? Why had Sherry's family's suspicions not been pursued more aggressively? Did Stephanie Lazarus's position in law enforcement help her avoid scrutiny? Those questions turned the case into more than a murder trial. It became a story about institutional failure, missed warning signs, and the danger of assuming that someone with a badge could not be the person behind the crime. At trial, prosecutors presented the DNA evidence, the personal history, and the argument that Lazarus had killed Sherry because of jealousy connected to John Ruetten. The defense challenged the state's case and argued that the evidence was old, that the investigation had problems, and that the prosecution could not prove its theory beyond a reasonable doubt. But the jury found otherwise. In 2012, Stephanie Lazarus was convicted of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to 27 years to life in prison. The conviction destroyed her career completely. The badge, the rank, the years of service, the image of authority, all of it became part of a darker story. She was no longer the detective investigating crime. She was the former officer convicted of hiding behind time, status, and the mistakes of an early investigation. For Sherry Rasmussen's family, the conviction brought legal accountability, but it could not restore what had been lost. Sherry had been young, newly married, building a life. Her family spent decades carrying grief and frustration while the case remained unsolved. Every year that passed without an answer was another year in which the truth felt delayed. That is the emotional center of this case. Justice eventually came, but it came after more than 2 decades. Stephanie Lazarus did not destroy her career in one public moment like some officers do. She destroyed it years earlier, prosecutors argued, when jealousy became violence and a police officer crossed the line from law enforcement into murder. The investigation simply took decades to reveal it. This case fits the title because it shows how a hidden crime can survive behind a respected career for years, but not forever. It shows how science can reopen the past. It shows how the public image of a trusted detective can collapse when old evidence finally speaks. Stephanie Lazarus had once carried a badge. But the cold case carried the truth. And when detectives finally followed that truth back to her, the career she had built became part of the evidence of how long she had escaped accountability. Case 4. The cop who returned to her own crime scene. Some police officers destroy their careers by breaking the rules. Others destroy them by crossing so far into criminal darkness that the badge becomes part of the horror. Antoinette Frank was a New Orleans police officer. She wore the uniform. She drove the patrol car. She carried the authority of the city. To the public, that badge meant safety, order, and the promise that if danger came, people like her would respond. But in March 1995, Frank became the danger. The case unfolded at Kim On Restaurant in New Orleans East, a family-run Vietnamese restaurant where Officer Ronald Williams sometimes worked in off-duty security detail. Williams was also a New Orleans police officer. He had a newborn child and a life outside the uniform. He was not only a fellow officer. He was a husband, a father, and a man trusted to protect the business that night. The other victims were Ha Vu and Quang Vu, members of the family that owned the restaurant. They were young, working inside a family business, living the kind of immigrant family story built on long hours, sacrifice, and hope. That night, the people inside the restaurant had every reason to believe a police officer meant protection. But that image would not survive what happened next. According to court records, Antoinette Frank and Rogers Lacaze were arrested later that day in connection with the murders. Prosecutors argued that Frank and Lacaze were involved in a robbery that turned into a triple killing. Officer Ronald Williams was killed. Ha Vu and Quang Vu were killed. The restaurant became a crime scene. What made the case even more disturbing was Frank's connection to the location. She was not a random criminal walking into a business she had never known. She knew the restaurant. She had been connected to security work there. She knew Ronald Williams. She understood the trust people placed in police officers. And after the killings, the story took a turn that made the case infamous. Frank returned to the scene in a police patrol car. To anyone watching from the outside, that return could have looked like an officer coming to help. A uniformed responder arriving after violence. A person with authority stepping into chaos. But investigators and witnesses would come to see something very different. She was not returning as the protector. She was returning as a suspect connected to the crime itself. Surviving members of the Vu family who had hidden during the attack became crucial. Their identification and testimony helped expose the truth. The case also included evidence connected to the robbery, the co-defendant, and the timeline of events after the killings. The first public image was almost impossible to reconcile with the facts. A police officer responding to a crime scene. But behind that image, prosecutors said, was a police officer who had helped create it. Frank's career did not collapse because of a misunderstanding, a split-second error, or a disputed policy violation. It collapsed because the justice system concluded she had participated in one of the most serious betrayals imaginable. a law enforcement officer involved in the murder of another officer and 2 civilians during a robbery. Her trial began in September 1995. The case moved quickly once it reached the jury. She was convicted on all 3 counts of first-degree murder. The jury recommended the death penalty. The court sentenced her to death. Years of appeals followed, as they often do in capital cases. Her defense raised issues connected to sentencing and mitigation. The Louisiana Supreme Court reviewed the case and ultimately affirmed the sentence. Decades later, Frank remained one of the most recognizable examples of a police officer whose badge became tied to a death row conviction. In 2023, a clemency effort was denied by Louisiana's Pardon Board, keeping the death sentence in place at that time. The legal outcome is severe, but the emotional damage goes beyond the sentence. Officer Ronald Williams was killed while working security. He was a fellow police officer, someone who wore the same profession Frank did. His death was not only a loss to his family. It was also a rupture inside the law enforcement world itself. Ha Vu and Quang Vu were killed inside their family's business. Their mother and surviving relatives had to live with the fact that the person later convicted was a police officer, someone the public is conditioned to trust in moments of danger. That is why this case fits the title so strongly. Antoinette Frank destroyed her career by destroying the very meaning of the badge she wore. A badge is supposed to make people safer. In this case, prosecutors argued, it helped her move through the world with trust she did not deserve. It made her presence less suspicious. It made her return to the scene look at first glance like duty. And that is the deepest betrayal. When a civilian commits a robbery or murder, the crime is already devastating. But when a police officer is involved, the damage spreads further. It damages public trust. It makes people question the systems meant to protect them. It leaves victims' families carrying not only grief, but also the knowledge that authority itself was part of the danger. Antoinette Frank's case remains disturbing because it shows how completely a public role can collapse when private choices reveal the opposite of what that role represents. She was trained to enforce the law. She was paid to protect the public. She wore the same uniform as one of the men who died. And when the truth came out, the uniform could not protect her from accountability. The officer who returned to the crime scene as if she belonged there was eventually exposed as one of the people responsible. The badge did not survive the evidence. The career did not survive the courtroom. And the lives lost inside Kim On Restaurant became a permanent reminder of what happens when someone trusted with authority turns that trust into access, deception, and violence. Case 5. The policewoman who turned family into insurance money. Some officers destroy their careers by crossing a professional line. Others destroy them by becoming the very kind of person the public expects police to stop. The case of Nomia Rosemary Ndlovu is one of the darkest examples of that betrayal. She was a South African police officer, once part of the South African Police Service. Her job placed her inside a system built to protect the public, investigate crimes, and help families in their most desperate moments. To ordinary people, a police officer is supposed to represent safety. A person who knows the law. A person who understands the value of evidence, accountability, and human life. But behind Rosemary Ndlovu's badge, prosecutors said, there was something colder. Money. Insurance policies. And a pattern of death inside her own family. Unlike some cases where a career collapses after one sudden act, Ndlovu's downfall came after years of hidden violence. Her victims were not strangers on the street. They were people connected to her by family, intimacy, and trust. They included relatives and her partner. People who would never expect a policewoman in their own circle to be connected to danger. That is what makes this case so disturbing. The badge was not just a career. It was part of the mask. According to the court record, Ndlovu was convicted of murdering 6 people. Prosecutors argued that she took out life and funeral insurance policies and then benefited financially when those people died. What should have been family grief became, in the state's case, a business model. A cousin, a sister, a partner, a niece, nephews. One by one, deaths began forming a pattern that could no longer be ignored. At first, each death could appear separate. That is one reason the case lasted as long as it did. Families can suffer tragedy. People can die in different ways. Insurance payouts by themselves do not automatically prove murder. But when the same person keeps appearing around policies, claims, and deaths, investigators begin asking a harder question. Was this grief? Or was it profit? The first cracks came when the pattern became too visible. Insurance companies, investigators, and police began looking more closely at Ndlovu's connections to the victims and the payouts that followed. Her role as a police officer made the allegations even more unsettling. She knew how investigations worked. She understood what police looked for. She would have understood the importance of timing, statements, and appearances. But the evidence started closing in. The case became even stronger when prosecutors presented evidence connected to attempted future killings. Ndlovu was accused of trying to arrange more murders, including plans involving family members. In one widely reported part of the case, a person approached in connection with a planned killing helped expose what was happening instead of carrying it out. That moment changed the shape of the story. The woman who once wore a police uniform was now being described as someone trying to hire people to kill. Not protect. Not investigate. Go. The courtroom heard about insurance policies, suspicious deaths, attempted murder, fraud, and incitement. The state argued that Ndlovu's motive was financial gain. This was not presented as a moment of panic or a crime of passion. It was presented as a long-running pattern of using human lives as a way to collect money. In 2021, the court convicted her. She received 6 life sentences for the murders, along with additional sentences for other crimes connected to the case. The punishment reflected the scale of the betrayal. This was not one ruined career. It was a series of lives taken, families broken, and trust destroyed. Her law enforcement identity made the case even more painful for the public. Because police officers often meet people when they are vulnerable. After deaths. After violence. After accidents. After disappearances. They are expected to stand beside grieving families, not create grief inside their own. Rosemary Ndlovu's case turned that expectation upside down. The people closest to her became targets, according to the court's findings. Family bonds became access. Insurance documents became motive. Death became a payout. That is why this case fits the title so strongly. She destroyed her career not by failing at police work, but by betraying the moral foundation that police work is supposed to stand on. A police officer should understand that a life is not a claim form. A family member is not an opportunity. A funeral is not a financial transaction. But prosecutors showed that Ndlovu treated tragedy as something she could arrange, collect from, and then move past. The case also exposed a deeper fear. When someone inside law enforcement becomes criminal, how long can they hide behind the trust their position gives them? If the public sees a police officer, they may lower their guard. If relatives know someone works in law enforcement, they may assume that person understands justice, not that they are capable of avoiding it. That is the danger of authority when it is used as a disguise. For the victims' families, the courtroom outcome could not undo the years of loss. It could not restore the relatives who died. It could not give back the normal meaning of family gatherings, phone calls, or trust. Every insurance policy, every payout, every hidden plan became part of a larger wound. And even after her 2021 sentence, Ndlovu's name continued appearing in court reporting connected to further alleged or proven plots. That added another layer to her public image. Not only a former officer convicted of serial murders, but someone whose criminal story did not end with one trial. The career was gone. The badge was gone. The public trust was gone. What remained was a case that showed how greed can live behind respectability, how family access can become dangerous, and how a police officer can become one of the most feared criminals in the country. Rosemary Ndlovu once belonged to the institution that investigates murder. In the end, murder investigations exposed her. And the badge she once wore became part of the reason the betrayal felt so complete. Case 6. The detective whose jealousy became murder. Some officers lose their careers because they make a professional mistake. Others lose them because the private life they tried to control finally erupts into violence. The case of Alfreda Fluker begins in Birmingham, Alabama, with a police detective who had spent 15 years inside law enforcement. She was not new to the job. She was not someone unfamiliar with crime scenes, evidence, investigations, or the consequences of pulling a trigger. She had served with the Birmingham Police Department and worked in a role that gave her authority, experience, and public trust. But in April 2020, the badge could not protect her from what prosecutors later said she chose to do. The victim was Kenesha Nicole Fuller. She was 43 years old, a woman with a family, a mother who loved her, and a life that should not have ended inside a police vehicle because of someone else's jealousy. The man who survived was Mario Theodore White. He was also connected to the Birmingham Police Department. Reporting described him as Fluker's police partner and longtime boyfriend. Prosecutors said Fuller was with White inside his unmarked police vehicle when Fluker found them. That detail became central to the case. A police car, normally a symbol of authority, became the scene of a personal confrontation. Two officers connected by work and romance. A woman caught in the middle. and a detective who, according to prosecutors, crossed the line from hurt and anger into deliberate violence. At first glance, people might be tempted to reduce the case to a love triangle. But that phrase can make the crime sound smaller than it was. This was not only a relationship dispute. It was a murder case. A woman died. Another person was the target of attempted murder. And the person convicted was a police detective trained to understand exactly what a gun can do. On April 10, 2020, shots were fired in Birmingham. Officers responded to the scene and found Kenesha Fuller wounded inside an unmarked police vehicle. She was taken to the hospital, but she did not survive. Mario White was not physically injured, but he became central to the story investigators had to untangle. The investigation quickly pointed toward Alfreda Fluker. She was arrested. She was charged. And almost immediately, the public image of a veteran detective began collapsing. The first crack was the setting itself. This was not a random street crime with no connection to law enforcement. The vehicle was connected to police. The people involved were connected to police. The suspect was a detective. The surviving man was her police partner and romantic partner. Everything about the case forced the department and the public to confront a deeply uncomfortable truth. The person accused was not someone police were chasing from the outside. She was one of their own. At trial, prosecutors argued that Fluker acted with intent. They described her as calculated and deliberate. According to reporting from the trial, prosecutors said she found Fuller and White together and intentionally fired into the vehicle. The defense told a different story. They argued that Fluker was overwhelmed by anger, that she acted in the heat of passion, and that she did not go there planning to kill Kenesha Fuller or harm Mario White. In that version, the shooting was not cold calculation but a personal breakdown in a moment of emotional shock. But the jury had to decide what the evidence proved. And the jury rejected the defense enough to convict her of capital murder and attempted murder. That verdict destroyed the last public remains of Fluker's police career. She was no longer a detective who made a mistake. She was a former officer convicted in a killing connected to jealousy, a police vehicle, and a relationship conflict that ended with a woman dead. In February 2023, Alfreda Fluker was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentence was final in the way life without parole sentences are meant to be final. No return to the department. No rebuilding of a police career. No second version of the public identity she once had. For Kenesha Fuller's family, the sentence could bring accountability, but it could not bring Kenesha back. Her mother spoke publicly about the pain of the loss and the importance of accountability, making clear that titles do not give people the right to take lives. That statement captured the moral center of the case. No matter what your position is, a victim still has a family. No matter what badge you carry, another person's life is not yours to end. That is why this case fits the title so strongly. Alfreda Fluker destroyed her career because she allowed private jealousy to become public violence. She had training. She had years of experience. She understood evidence, weapons, crime scenes, and consequences. But in the moment that mattered most, prosecutors said she used violence instead of control. The case also shows how dangerous it becomes when someone with police authority brings that authority into personal conflict. An ordinary argument can already become volatile. But when one person carries a service weapon, knows police procedures, and is accustomed to command, the risk becomes even greater. The badge does not make anger safer. The badge makes responsibility heavier. For Birmingham, the case was not only about one former detective. It was about the damage done when someone inside law enforcement becomes the person standing before the court. It damages trust. It forces departments to answer for the behavior of their own. And it leaves the public asking how someone trained to respond to violence could become the source of it. Kenesha Fuller should not be remembered only as the woman in the middle of a police officer's relationship conflict. She was the victim. Her life mattered before the case, before the headlines, before the courtroom, before the sentence. Alfreda Fluker had built a 15-year career in policing. But one horrific choice ended that career forever. A detective who once investigated crime became a defendant. A badge that once gave her authority became part of the betrayal. And the jealousy she brought into that night became the reason she would spend the rest of her life in prison. Case 7. The officer who took her badge into a love triangle. Some police careers collapse because of what happens on duty. Others collapse because an officer carries the power, weapon, and mindset of the job into a private life that is already falling apart. The case of Yvonne Wu begins in New York City, with a police officer whose personal relationship turned into a deadly crime. Wu was an NYPD officer. She had served in one of the largest police departments in the United States, a department where officers are trained to respond to danger, control chaos, and use force only within strict legal limits. She carried a badge, a service weapon, and the authority of the city. But in October 2021, prosecutors said she used that weapon in a way that destroyed her career and took an innocent life. The victim who died was Jamie Leong. The surviving victim was Jenny Lee. Jenny had been in a relationship with Yvonne Wu. By the time of the shooting, that relationship had ended, and Jenny was involved with Jamie Leong. That private emotional triangle became the hidden tension behind the case. A breakup, jealousy, anger. A former partner unable to accept the life someone else was trying to build. But this was not only a personal conflict. It became a murder case because Wu brought a gun into that conflict. On October 13, 2021, Yvonne Wu went to Jenny Lee's home in Brooklyn. According to prosecutors, she entered the home and shot both women using her NYPD-issued weapon. Jamie Leong was killed. Jenny Lee survived. The setting made the crime even more disturbing. This was not a confrontation in a police precinct or during an official call. This was a private home. A place where Jenny and Jamie should have been safe from the reach of someone else's anger. Instead, the person who entered was a police officer with a service weapon. That image would not survive the investigation. At first, the case carried the language of a love triangle in some headlines. But that phrase can make the story sound smaller than it was. It can make violence sound like drama. It can reduce a victim's death to a relationship dispute. Jamie Leong was not a plot point in someone else's jealousy. She was a person. A daughter. A loved one. A woman whose life was ended because someone with power and a weapon crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Investigators quickly focused on Wu. The evidence included the scene, the surviving victim, the weapon, and the circumstances surrounding the relationship. Prosecutors said Wu had gone to the home and carried out the attack. The legal system treated the case as a serious act of violence, not a private misunderstanding. The charges against her were severe. She was initially charged in connection with murder and attempted murder. The indictment also included burglary and assault-related allegations, showing that prosecutors believed the crime began with unlawful entry and escalated into deadly violence. For the public, the case raised familiar but painful questions. What happens when a police officer becomes dangerous off-duty? What happens when the weapon issued by the department is used in a private attack? And how many warning signs appear before a person in authority reaches the point of violence? The courtroom eventually brought a legal resolution. In June 2024, Yvonne Wu pleaded guilty to first-degree manslaughter and second-degree attempted murder. The plea meant she admitted legal responsibility for killing Jamie Leong and attempting to kill Jenny Lee. It also meant the families would not have to endure a long trial with every detail replayed again and again. In August 2024, Wu was sentenced to 27 years in prison. By then, her law enforcement career was over. The department uniform, the badge, the title of officer, all of it had been replaced by a criminal conviction and a prison sentence. But again, the career was not the deepest loss. Jamie Leong's life was. At sentencing, the pain of the families became part of the public record. Loved ones had to describe the impact of a death that never should have happened. They had to stand inside a courtroom and speak about someone who was gone because a former partner's anger turned into gunfire. For Jenny Lee, survival did not mean the harm ended. Surviving a shooting means carrying both physical and emotional consequences. It means remembering the moment, living with the loss of the person beside you, and knowing that the person who attacked you was once someone close enough to share your private life. That is what makes this case so painful. Yvonne Wu did not only betray the badge. She betrayed intimacy, trust, and the basic safety of a home. Police officers are trained to understand escalation. They are trained to understand the danger of weapons. They are trained to know that anger and firearms are a deadly combination. When an officer ignores that knowledge, the betrayal becomes heavier. A civilian with a gun can do terrible harm. But a trained officer with a service weapon carries an extra layer of responsibility because the weapon is tied to public trust. Wu's case shows how quickly a private obsession can become a public tragedy. It also shows how the role of police officer does not disappear when someone is off duty. The training, weapon, authority, and public expectations follow them. So when they commit a violent crime, the damage reaches beyond the victims and into the community's trust in law enforcement itself. This case fits the title because Yvonne Wu destroyed her career by taking the tools of her profession into the collapse of her personal life. She had a badge. She had training. She had years ahead of her. But one criminal decision ended Jamie Leong's life, injured Jenny Lee, and turned Wu from an NYPD officer into a convicted former officer sentenced to decades in prison. The badge could not save her from the evidence. The plea could not erase the harm. And the sentence could not restore the life that was taken. In the end, Yvonne Wu's career did not simply end because of a scandal. It ended because she crossed the line every officer is sworn to defend. The line between protecting life and destroying it. Case 8. The Decorated Cop and the Hitman Plot. Some officers destroy their careers because they lose control in a single violent moment. Others destroy them before any victim is physically harmed, when the planning itself reveals how far they were willing to go. The case of Valerie Cincinnelli begins in New York, with a police officer who had spent years inside one of the most recognizable law enforcement agencies in America. Cincinnelli was an NYPD officer. She had worn the uniform, carried the authority of the city, and lived with the public image of someone trained to protect life. To the outside world, she was not supposed to be the kind of person connected to a murder plot. She was supposed to be the person who helped stop one. But prosecutors said that behind the badge, there was a private life full of bitterness, jealousy, and revenge. The alleged targets were her estranged husband, Isaiah Carvalho Jr., and the teenage daughter of her then-boyfriend, John DeRubba. That detail made the case even more disturbing. This was not a stranger-on-stranger plot. This was built around personal relationships, resentment, and people close enough to know one another's routines. According to reporting, Cincinnelli was in the middle of a bitter divorce and custody battle with her estranged husband. Prosecutors said she paid DeRubba $7,000 to hire a hitman to kill Carvalho. But then the alleged plot expanded. Reports said DeRubba went to authorities when Cincinnelli also wanted his teenage daughter included as a target. That decision changed everything. Instead of the plot moving forward in secret, law enforcement stepped in and began building a case. The first story she may have believed she was controlling was no longer in her hands. The FBI became involved, and the investigation turned into a sting. According to reporting, federal agents had Isaiah Carvalho fake his own death. They staged the appearance of a murder so investigators could watch what Cincinnelli did when she believed the plan had been carried out. That moment became the heart of the case. Because when someone is told that a murder they arranged has happened, the reaction matters. Do they panic? Do they call police? Do they show grief? Or do they start protecting themselves? Prosecutors said Cincinnelli was captured on recordings discussing alibis and trying to destroy evidence. The case included recordings, texts, the alleged payment, and the staged death operation. It was not simply a rumor from an angry ex or a dramatic accusation during a divorce. It became a federal investigation with recorded evidence and a controlled law enforcement operation. For the public, the case felt almost unbelievable. A police officer accused of trying to arrange a killing. A fake death staged by the FBI. A custody battle turning into an alleged murder-for-hire plot. A teenage girl allegedly becoming a target because of jealousy and resentment. Everything about it carried the feeling of a crime thriller, but the people involved were real. Their fear was real. The damage was real. And the legal consequences were real. Cincinnelli was arrested in 2019. At first, the charges included murder-for-hire allegations. Those charges were serious and carried the possibility of a much longer prison sentence. But the case did not end with a conviction on those counts. Instead, Cincinnelli pleaded guilty in 2021 to obstruction of justice. That distinction matters. A serious documentary must be careful here. She was accused of a murder-for-hire plot, but her guilty plea was to obstruction. She admitted legal responsibility for obstructing the investigation, not for a completed murder. The murder-for-hire charges were dropped as part of the plea arrangement. Still, the outcome destroyed her police career. A person cannot return to the public trust of law enforcement after a federal case like this. The badge, the department identity, the professional reputation, and the image of service all collapsed under the weight of the allegations, the guilty plea, and the sentence. In October 2021, she was sentenced to 48 months in prison. By then, the story had already become national true crime material. It had the elements that make the public unable to look away. A police officer, an alleged hitman plot, a fake death, recorded conversations, a divorce, jealousy, and a teenager said to be at risk. But beneath those headline details is something more serious. This case is about what happens when someone trained to enforce the law tries to manipulate the system from the inside. A police officer understands investigations. She understands evidence. She understands how cases are built. That knowledge can make the betrayal feel even deeper when prosecutors say the officer used planning, secrecy, and destruction of evidence instead of the law she was sworn to uphold. For Isaiah Carvalho, the case was not just a legal drama. Reporting described him speaking publicly about the FBI having him fake his own death. Imagine being told by federal agents that the person you once married is accused in a plot to have you killed. Imagine having to participate in a staged death because investigators believe that may help expose the truth. That is not something a person simply forgets. For the teenage girl allegedly targeted, the case carried another layer of fear. She was not part of an adult divorce. She was not an officer. She was not someone who chose to be drawn into a world of jealousy, custody battles, and alleged violence. She was a child pulled into the danger created by adults around her. That is why this case fits the title. Valerie Cincinnelli destroyed her career not through a moment of confusion on patrol, but through a private plot that prosecutors said turned revenge into planning. She had a badge, a secure public identity, and years of authority behind her. But the same career that once gave her credibility could not survive the evidence. The FBI staged the death. The recordings captured the aftermath. The federal case moved forward. The guilty plea ended the legal fight over obstruction. And the sentence turned a former NYPD officer into a convicted defendant. In the end, Valerie Cincinnelli's career did not collapse because the public misunderstood her. It collapsed because the investigation exposed a private world that could not exist beside the badge. A police officer is supposed to stop murder plots. She became the woman accused of trying to create one. Case 9. The K-9 officer whose force became a federal case. Some police careers end because of corruption. Others end because of one use-of-force decision that becomes bigger than the officer ever imagined. The case of Stephanie Moore begins in Prince George's County, Maryland, with a police officer who had built her career around one of the most specialized and respected roles in law enforcement, K-9 work. Moore was a police officer and K-9 handler. That role carries a very specific kind of authority. A K-9 officer does not only carry a badge and a weapon. She also controls a trained police dog, an animal powerful enough to chase, restrain, and injure a suspect when released. That kind of power requires judgment. It requires control. It requires an officer to understand that a police dog is not just a tool. It is force. And in 1995, one decision involving that force changed Stephanie Moore's life forever. The case began after officers responded to a suspected burglary situation involving two men on the roof of a building in the Tacoma Park area. According to the federal appellate record, officers surrounded the suspects, a helicopter illuminated the scene, and the men were ordered to climb down from the roof. The government's case was that the suspects were obeying commands, had their hands raised, and were not resisting when Moore released her police dog. The dog bit Ricardo Mendez, one of the suspects. In many police encounters, a dog bite might remain an internal report, a use-of-force review, or a civil complaint. But this incident became something much larger. Federal prosecutors eventually brought a civil rights case, arguing that Moore had willfully used unreasonable force under color of law. That phrase, under color of law, is important. It means the crime was not treated like a private act by a private citizen. It was treated as an abuse of power by someone acting with official authority. That is why this case fits the title. Stephanie Moore's career was not destroyed by something that happened outside her identity as a police officer. It was destroyed by something she did while wearing the authority of the state. Her public image before the case was strong. Reporting later described her as a highly commended officer, and supporters emphasized that she had been the first female canine handler in the department's history. In that version of her story, she was a pioneering officer doing a difficult job. But the government presented a different picture. Prosecutors argued that this was not a justified K-9 deployment against a fleeing or dangerous suspect. They argued that the dog was released when the suspect was already under control. They also introduced evidence about other incidents involving Moore's use of a police dog, which the appellate court later discussed in reviewing the conviction. The courtroom had to decide whether this was a split-second police decision or a criminal civil rights violation. That is what made the case so controversial. Moore and her supporters maintained that she had done her job and that the prosecution was unfair. Law enforcement organizations later argued strongly that the sentence was excessive and that the case reflected a broader political climate around police misconduct investigations. But the jury convicted her. And the federal appellate court affirmed the conviction. Moore was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison. For a police officer, that kind of sentence is career-ending in the most complete way. She did not only lose her job. She became a convicted felon. She became the former officer whose name was tied to a federal civil rights case. The same system she had once served was now the system that sent her to prison. The case also forces a difficult conversation about police force. A police dog can save officers from danger. It can help locate suspects. It can end dangerous situations without a firearm. But when used improperly, it can also become a weapon against someone who is already under control. That is the moral tension inside this case. Police officers are often asked to make decisions in stressful environments. But the law still draws lines. A badge does not give unlimited power. A suspect does not lose basic rights because they are suspected of a crime. And force must match the situation. For Ricardo Mendez, the incident was not a policy debate. It was a physical injury caused during an encounter with police. The appellate record described the government's version clearly. He was bitten while complying with commands, his hands raised, surrounded by officers. For more, the consequences lasted decades. She served her sentence and was released. Years later, in December 2020, President Donald Trump granted her a full pardon. Supporters saw the pardon as long-awaited vindication. Critics saw it differently, arguing that pardoning a police civil rights conviction sent a troubling message about accountability. That divide is part of why this case remains complex. Legally, she was convicted, the conviction was affirmed, and she served prison time. Politically and publicly, her supporters continued to argue she had been treated unfairly. The pardon changed her legal status in an important way, but it did not erase the fact that her police career had been destroyed long before. She could never return to the simple public image she once had: pioneering K-9 officer, trusted handler, respected member of the force. That image had been replaced by a much more complicated one. A former officer convicted in federal court. A woman who served 10 years. A case that divided people who saw it either as accountability or injustice. Stephanie Moore's story is not like the murder cases in this documentary. It is not about a dead victim or a hidden family crime. It is about force, authority, and the power police hold over people who are already surrounded, already outnumbered, and already under state control. That is why it belongs here. Because a police career can be destroyed not only by killing, stealing, or plotting violence, but by abusing force in a way the law recognizes as criminal. The badge gives authority. The K-9 gives power. But when that power crosses the line, the courtroom can take everything back. Stephanie Moore once stood in the public image of a skilled K-9 officer. By the end of the case, her name had become a federal civil rights conviction, a 10-year sentence, a presidential pardon, and a warning about how one use of force decision can follow an officer for the rest of her life. Case 10. The officer who used trust to silence teenagers. Some police careers end because of one violent moment. A weapon fired. A door opened. A traffic stop gone wrong. But Delia Ruiz's case is different. Her career did not collapse in the middle of a public confrontation. It collapsed because of what prosecutors said she did in private, away from the patrol car, away from the public eye, and away from the image people expect when they see a police officer in a small town. Ruiz was a former officer with the Friona Police Department in Texas. In a smaller community, that title carries a particular kind of weight. People recognize local officers. Families see them around town. Teenagers know who they are. A police officer is not just another adult. She represents rules, safety, authority, and the idea that if someone vulnerable is in danger, she is supposed to help. That was the image. But the truth that came out in federal court was very different. According to federal prosecutors, Ruiz sexually assaulted at least 2 teenage boys. She later pleaded guilty to enticement of a minor. By the time she stood before a federal judge, the story was no longer about suspicion or rumor. It was about a former police officer admitting legal responsibility for conduct involving minors. The victims were identified in court documents by protective names, not full public identities. That privacy matters. These were teenagers. Their names do not need to be exposed for the seriousness of the crime to be understood. What matters is the imbalance of power, the secrecy, and the fact that the adult in this case had once worn a badge. Prosecutors said one victim was 16 when the abuse began in fall 2020. It continued into spring 2021, when he turned 17. A second victim was 15 when Ruiz began exploiting him after meeting him at the first boy's home. That detail is important because it shows how the harm expanded. This was not one blurred boundary or one isolated conversation. Prosecutors described a pattern where access to one teenager led to access to another. One secret created the space for another secret. One vulnerable child became connected to another child through the same adult's choices. And then came the line that revealed the most. Federal prosecutors said Ruiz warned one of the teenagers not to tell anyone because she could get into serious trouble. That warning matters because it shows awareness. She knew there would be consequences. She knew the truth could destroy her career. She knew that what was happening could not survive daylight. And instead of stopping, prosecutors said she tried to keep the teenager silent. That is the moment where the public image collapses. A police officer is supposed to be the person a child can tell when something is wrong. But in this case, the officer became the person telling a child not to talk. The investigation eventually grew beyond one local department. The Texas Rangers, the FBI's Dallas field office through its Lubbock resident agency, the Amarillo Police Department, and the Friona Police Department were involved. That outside involvement mattered because when the accused person is an officer, the public needs confidence that the case is not being protected by the badge. The truth had to be stronger than the uniform. Ruiz was arrested in October 2021. After the arrest, she was fired from the Friona Police Department. The career that once gave her authority was already over, but the legal consequences were still coming. In January, she pleaded guilty to enticement of a minor. Then, in June 2022, she was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. That sentence made the message clear. This was not a department scandal. It was not a private embarrassment. It was a federal criminal case involving minors and a former officer who had abused trust. This case fits the title because Delia Ruiz destroyed her career by betraying the very people she should have been trained to protect. Teenagers can be confused by attention from adults. They can be manipulated by secrecy. They can feel fear, shame, or pressure when the adult involved has authority. And when that adult is a police officer, the pressure can become even heavier. Because the badge does not make the power imbalance smaller. It makes it larger. A teenager may wonder who will believe him. He may fear getting in trouble. He may not fully understand the legal meaning of what is happening. He may know only that an adult with authority is telling him to stay quiet. That is why the betrayal in this case is so serious. Ruiz once represented protection. But prosecutors said she became the person the victims needed protection from. For the victims, the 20-year sentence may have brought accountability, but it could not undo the damage. Cases involving exploitation by trusted adults can follow young people for years. They can affect trust, confidence, relationships, and the way victims see authority figures for the rest of their lives. That is why this story should not be treated like gossip about a fallen officer. It is not only about a woman losing her job. It is about teenagers being harmed by someone who should have understood the law better than almost anyone around them. Delia Ruiz had a badge. She had public trust. She had the chance to serve her community honorably. But the investigation exposed the private reality behind that image. The guilty plea confirmed the crime. The sentence made the consequence permanent. And in the end, the officer who should have protected vulnerable teenagers became the former officer sentenced to federal prison for betraying them.